Hi, everyone. I am Kate Ott. I'm the author of, yay, Sex, Tech, and Faith, Ethics for a Digital Age. And I'm sure you're wondering, why is the Christian writing about sex, tech, and faith? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But first, let me say my day job is as a professor at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. I'm the Stead Professor of Christian Social Ethics, and I run the Stead Center on Ethics and Values. So there'll be much more coming out related to digital technology, ethics, and sexual ethics. So keep an eye out for that. A few other things about me. First, what do you see behind me? It is the globe, or a map, I guess, in watercolors, but I adapted it to my office space when COVID hit and we started doing everything online. So I'm grateful to have this both global background, but also really colorful background, because I hope that comes across in the way that I think about ethics and what's informed my ethics. Other fun facts, I am a dog lover, and so maybe you will get to meet them as you hear them bark in the background. I can't always control who's coming past the house or what loud truck might pass, and they'll bark. So perhaps you'll get to meet Wrigley and Lambo today through their voices. Also, my passion is for writing and teaching. So I am so grateful that my profession is something that allows me to do my passion. And where do I live? Who do I love to write for? And what do I love to teach most? Youth, young adults, parents, and Christians in faith communities. That's the community I've been raised in. Those are the folks that I find as my conversation partners. So my very, very, very first love coming out of theological school was to be in faith communities, teaching sexuality education and faith-based values to young people. It's in that space that I started to get the ideas, or I guess the questions about eventually writing this book, because young people and their parents would ask me, and I didn't have answers. And I realized that lots of adults like me didn't have the answers either. And so we needed a book for ourselves. So this book isn't directly for youth or their parents. I mean, I guess for parents, anyone can read it. It's especially for adults in Christian communities. And then there's a section of it that's for youth and young adults. So that was one of the first questions we received. Why this book? And really, it was because I didn't have good answers to questions people were asking me about sexuality and the changes in digital technology. And I thought, if I'm going to keep doing this education in faith communities, I need to go search for some answers. Now, another question we received about this book is not just why this book, but what was challenging about writing it, what's sort of the main gist behind it, and what do we hope people take away from reading the book? So I'm going to answer that actually by reading you something I wrote. The good thing about books is that, sometimes you write it down pretty clearly and it's better just to read it. So this is part of the introduction. It starts on page 2. This book is a Christian digital sexual ethic that helps readers wrestle with pressing questions about the advancement of digital technologies, consider their effects on sexuality and relationships, and stay educated about sexual and digital changes. This isn't part of the text, it's a different line, but did you know that the sex tech industry is over $30 billion? That some of the most searched sites after Google and Amazon are pornography sites? This impacts individuals and societies, and we can't ignore it in faith communities anymore. And I don't mean that we should get up from a pulpit and rail against it. I want to ask us to think about the way that education and entertainment and everything in between are affected by digital technology. Let's be curious and inquisitive about what's happening, because honestly, that's what people in the pews are doing. There's an app to assist with better orgasms, breaking up with a partner, meeting the perfect match, reporting sexual abuse. There are also devices to check sperm health, have virtual sex with an avatar, or connect to a partner's vibrator in a completely different country. There's also a robot to help with masturbation or serve as a companion. Now, one book can't cover all sex tech. Neither can one Christian ethic. In our Christian communities, we tend towards something called rule-based ethics when it comes to sexuality. When it comes to other things like economics or thinking about feeding the hungry or creation care, we have really nuanced kind of experiences of that, and we leave room for a lot of different ways for people to live that ethic. But when it comes to sexual ethics, we tend to move back to rule-based ethics. So what do I have to say about that? Well, common rule-based ethical approaches cannot adequately respond to the rapid pace of digital technological innovation and growing awareness of sexual and gender diversities. Digital technologies reshape who and how we are in all aspects of life, including our sexuality. They're not simply tools we need to resist or control. Understanding the intersection of sexuality and digital technologies requires a level of curiosity about sexuality, sexual behaviors, relationships, and digital technologies. And this needs to be modeled through engagement with holistic sexuality education and digital literacies. It also means we need to reconsider how we understand Christian sexual ethics. So that leads to another question that we received. What are some key words your book discusses that people might not be familiar with? Well, obviously, I'm not sure people are really familiar with sex robots, but we all think we know what those two words are. Our imagination about sex robots is not reality yet. What's going on in a show like Westworld doesn't exist in technological development yet, and we're probably a good amount of years away from it. Some of the technical language I spend a good amount of time on, and I do describe. For example, some folks in psychology are suggesting that there's a new sexual orientation called digisexuality, which are individuals who are oriented towards engagement with technology to experience their sexuality. They'd much rather be in virtual reality or using AI toys or devices as opposed to interacting with other humans in a relationship. So that's a word I didn't know before I started writing this book. But I actually think we can go back even from that and say one of the key words I think I spend a lot of time in this book on is just the word sexuality. In Christian faith communities, my experience, having been all over North America and speaking with youth and parents, is that we reduce the word sexuality to sexual behaviors or sexual orientation. And in sexuality education, sexuality is so much more than that. It's about sensuality, intimacy, sexual and reproductive health, sexual abuse and violence issues in relationship. Orientation and gender identity is definitely part of that, but not the only part. And yes, sexual behaviors are part of that too. But for the most part, sexual behaviors are a very small part of our everyday experience of sexuality. Instead, it's about intimacy and sensuality and just living in our skin, what in Christian traditions we would call embodiment. So I want the reader to engage this really robust definition of sexuality and to see that that's part of all of our lives, regardless of whether we're in a particular relationship or we have a specific gender identity or sexual orientation. Instead, we're sexual beings from birth till death. And that's something our faith communities aren't that great at talking about. What does that lead to as we think about the role of Christianity and how we think about Christian sexual ethics with regard to that big definition of sexuality? Well, specific to digital technologies, it means in this book that I invite you to think about what our historic theologies of the body have been, how issues of theology and self-sacrifice can contribute to sexual violence and gender discrimination, how we might live out the love commandment, not only in relationship to other human beings, but also to technologies, to devices, to robots, how we need to participate in the body of Christ, not only thinking about ourselves individually, but the way that various people's expressions of their sexuality expand our understandings of who we are in the world, how God created us to be, and why that's something that we could celebrate instead of shaming or denying. And then lastly, perhaps the way in which we think about incarnation, about Christ being present, not only in the flesh and embodied, so there's a goodness about our bodies and our flesh, but also that Christ is there where two or three are gathered. And does that include virtual reality? Does that include right now, the way that we are here together speaking? So thinking about sexuality more broadly involves expanding to relationships, to intimacy, to sensuality, but it also helps us rethink some of our ideas about Christianity. And so that was another question that came across for us. Why is this such a crucial conversation for Christians? Well, the first answer to that is pretty obvious. Christians are experiencing this. We don't live in some huge bubble devoid of digital technologies. Many Christians are involved in the various kinds of aspects of digital technology I cover in this book. Use of pornography, self-made pornography through sexting, dating apps, experiences and or perpetration of sexual violence through online technologies, using virtual reality to create and have relationships or engage in behaviors. Most of us are not yet involved with sex robots or robot companions because they're not as widespread, but we may be at some point. And honestly, we do all have relationships with artificial intelligence. If you just think about how you feel about your home assistant, I'm not going to say the names because then mine will beep. But you know what I mean, or your phone assistant of Siri or OK Google, you actually have a relationship there. And sometimes you probably get frustrated and irritated, and other times you think it's the best gift to you because you didn't forget someone important's birthday. How do we think about that from a theological perspective? If we're going to be Christians in the way we live and use digital technologies, we need to bring our values to those questions. And that means that the old rules that didn't know anything about digital technology need to be opened up for curious questions about how we think through these primary issues in our lives. So, why is this book so crucial for Christians? Well, I think the majority of Christians want to think about their sexuality through the lens of being whole, flourishing people, as well as holy people in our relationships. We can't do that when the primary discussions we have circle around shame and silence. Instead, we need education and information, and honestly, we need accompaniment. We need people to have these conversations with. And I think education and accompaniment were the primary ways Jesus taught. And so I want us to live into that tradition, even if it's in radically new topics that Jesus never would have imagined talking about while incarnated centuries ago, helping us understand what it means to be a Christian in the world. So Those were our primary questions. I'm going to look really quickly at my list to see if I've missed one in particular. I think those were the main ones, and I'll see if there's any comments in the chat. All right, I think we are good. Those were the main questions about the text. Let me also say I do not want to forget this. I did start out by saying one of my passions is talking with youth and young adults. So the end of this text has a youth study guide. So any of you out there in religious communities who work with youth or young adults, please check out the study guide. It's a way for you to read the text and then take these issues to talk maybe with your high school youth group or your young adult gathering. Those individuals are often the most affected by these changes in technology. They're often the ones who have questions about it. And I know we tend to think that youth and young adults are the most tech savvy among us. They are the most tech saturated, but it doesn't mean that they're tech savvy. It doesn't mean that they know how everything works, or perhaps how privacy and data collection is happening, or the effect that certain kinds of technologies might have on brain development, on relational formation or communication. So this book covers that. It covers how that might happen as we engage online sexually explicit material like pornography, or how we show up in a virtual reality and see the ways in which we might either dehumanize or actually, bring humanity and dignity to the people there that we are interacting with. It asks us to think about those questions while giving us the digital information. So please, if you are a religious leader and you're working with that group of people, or you are one, youth or young adult, please check out the study guide at the end. Great ways to engage these conversations and have an ongoing study of the book and the issues that are out there. All right, so that said, where to buy it? Well, the usual places. You could, publisher's page, erdmans.com. You can also get it Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the usual online places. You can buy it as an ebook, get it on your e-reader, or you can go ahead and get the paper copy, pre-order. It will be out August 16th. How to connect with me? Well, things like Facebook Live. I'm also doing a number of upcoming podcasts. Every time I do a podcast, you can find it on Twitter at Kate's Take, or you can see them reposted on my website at kateott.org. That's also where I put upcoming speaking events. And if your church or your faith community would like to invite me, I would love to come talk about the book, talk with your faith community, talk with teens, talk with parents. Again, kateott.org is where you can find that information and reposts of any other online conversations that I am having. What's next? Well, hopefully I come to a community near you and we get to have this conversation in an offline manner, think about these topics and issues, but I will be continuing to do research specifically in the area of how these issues affect youth and young adult relationship formation, not just sexuality relationships, but all forms of development. And you can also tune in on October 6th to the Yale Youth Ministry Institute, where we'll be having a conversation on this study guide, but also ways to expand our understanding and conversation about these issues with youth and young adults. So thanks so much for watching. It was great to be with you today. And please go check it out, Sex, Tech, and Faith.